If I were you, I would have fired me too. And the reason I fired Steve is Steve was frustrated creatively, and that was understandable. He was kind of injury prone during that period of his career. I could have dealt with that. But what I couldn't deal with was there was a situation where Steve was out with an injury, and Steve was still very important to WCW, but I knew I couldn't put him in the ring. We were shooting TV at this little place called Center Stage, and I wanted to keep Steve visible. I wanted him to do an interview. I knew he couldn't wrestle, but I wanted the audience to hear from Steve Austin. So we created an interview for him and something he could say. And he wasn't scheduled for TV. He wasn't on the schedule. But I called Tony Schiavone into my office. I said, Tony, do me a favor, call Steve Austin, because Steve lived in Atlanta. He only lived about 15 minutes from where we were shooting TV. I said, ask him to come down, let him know we want to do an interview so that we could at least keep him visible, keep the audience interested in him. So Tony, and this is the way Tony explained it to me, Tony goes over, calls Steve Austin. Steve's wife answers the phone. Tony said, hey, this is, Tony Schiavone, and Eric Bischoff wants Steve to come down to Center Stage. And by the way, I was paying him. He was under salary. He was working for me. Kind of an important part of the story. And Tony says, he wants Steve to come down, do this interview. He doesn't have to wrestle, doesn't have to be in his gear. It's just a sit-down 2-minute interview. We just want to keep him visible on TV, keep his story alive. According to Tony Schiavone, as he's explaining this to Steve's wife, Steve says, oh, you want Steve to come down to Center Stage and do an interview? Tony's on the phone, and he can hear Steve Austin in the background saying, tell them sons of bitches I ain't coming anywhere. F them. Tony Schiavone comes back and says, Steve said, F you. I went, okay, that's how that goes. And the next morning I fired him. I sent him a FedEx. You're fired. Because legally I had to do that. Everybody makes a big deal out of the FedEx. But contractually, if you would have read Steve's contract or anybody's contract at that time, I could call him and tell him you're fired.